I voted in favor to put back $21 million for mental health funding in the last budget, and I would do that again and again. But I think to address criminal justice on a much broader scale would make me very happy.
Great. All right, so there's been a lot of talk about party registration on Election Day, especially in the wake of the summer primaries. Recent numbers suggest that more than 12,500 Wyoming voters changed their party affiliations during the primary election. Do you agree with the following statement? Wyoming residents who are eligible to vote should be able to register and or change their party affiliation on Election Day at the polls. And I believe it's Representative Olson's turn.
Thank you. So a really important question in Wyoming right now, and I think I would split that question up because should we be able to register same day on Election Day? Absolutely. In fact, that is what gives us a lot of the exemptions that we need so as not to fall under certain federal laws that are more restrictive on our voting rights. So a first-time person moving into Wyoming, absolutely. I spend a lot of time in my district walking house to house. I've met many people who have moved here, and the first question they ask me is, well, how do I register? And so I'm explaining that process to them, and I don't want to disenfranchise their votes. I think there's another part of the question, which is whether we should have a primary and a general in Wyoming, and I think that's really the question that we're engaging in right now. A primary is a system guided by the political parties. It's meant for a political party to select its candidate and then send each one to the general. If we don't like that system, then we could revisit something different, and I'm definitely open to that conversation. California has what's called a jungle primary. Everyone runs, and we just take the top go-getters. Is that a possibility? Is that a solution for Wyoming? I don't know. Runoff primaries could also be a solution. Having different types of systems like we run city council races and commissioner races that have multiple candidates that we take from each party. There's lots of different ways to skin that cat, and I think what's important right now is that we continue the conversation in Wyoming about the system that we want. It's not about winners and losers from the past election. It's about carving a system that works for Wyoming for the future.
Great. And a 30-second follow-up. Do you think that the way that it works right now is sufficient, or do you foresee those changes being necessary?
I absolutely don't think that the current system works well. But I don't know that the quote that you offered is the solution. That's what I want to make clear, is that changing registration and voting on the day of election is no solution in Wyoming. But revisiting the way we do elections, absolutely something we should have a conversation about.
Great. Thank you for clarifying. Mr. Taylor.
I want to, as many people as possible, to participate in our elections. In Wyoming, we have an abysmal voter participation rate. We just don't vote. I don't know why, but there's about 35 to 40% of the voting age population is all that votes in our elections. And is that in part that they are feeling that their voice doesn't matter during that election process? It might be. I think that there are multiple solutions to this. I think that part of the reason why so many people change parties is because they don't feel that they have a say in the general election. So if there is a way to ensure that everyone feels like their voice is being heard in the process, I think that would boost voter participation and also create a better a system for electing our representatives and senators and everyone else. I just think about a quote that's often attributed to Benjamin Franklin, and that is he walked out of the Constitutional Convention and somebody asked, what do we have? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. And if you can keep it part is the participation of the people in the democratic process of electing our representatives to our republic.
Okay, number 4. A recent University of Wyoming survey suggests that the majority of residents in Wyoming would support marijuana legalization for medicinal use, and nearly half would support full legalization. Where do you stand on making marijuana legal, either for medicinal or recreational use, or both? And Mr. Taylor.
I would support a well-vetted medical marijuana system that allows people to benefit from the use of medical marijuana. We have over 30 states that have implemented that, and we can look at what they have done to implement a system that could work for Wyoming, that could meet our needs. But it definitely would need to be vetted through the legislative process and getting the input of the people, and what would work for Wyoming may not work for somewhere else, or what somewhere else doesn't work for Wyoming 90% of the time. But as far as recreational marijuana goes, there's too many. Right now, it's classified as a Schedule I drug, which being a Schedule I drug, there's basically saying that there's no medicinal purpose for the drug, and it's highly likely that drug will be abused. So I think that there needs to be some federal action before Wyoming jumps on board to recreational use of marijuana, and so I just think that there needs to be a lot of federal reform or a Supreme Court decision reclassifying that drug before we go into full recreational use.
Hey, Representative Olson.
Yeah, I fundamentally disagree that we should sit on our hands and wait for the federal government or the Supreme Court to do something. This is part of criminal justice reform. In 2016, I authored legislation that reduced penalties and fines for marijuana use, and I did that intentionally because when we look at our prison systems, they're overrun with non-violent offenders. And that's a problem for Wyoming. One, because it costs a lot, and two, because we're not helping people when we lock away an 18-year-old kid who carries a Coca-Cola with THC across the border. We need to actually address those issues. So I would favor once again lowering and making civil penalties for a lot of those infractions. In terms of medical marijuana, I have a solid record that has supported helping hemp legalization in Wyoming, help CBD oil legalizations and allowing more access to CBD oil for medicinal purposes, and would support also a greater conversation about medical marijuana, one that I hope that we are actually going to have this session. The state of Utah, interestingly enough, is right now looking at a special session to address the issue of legalizing marijuana for medical purposes. And while I don't think we should have a special session to do it, I would like to see a bill that does that in Wyoming as well.
Right. Yes, go ahead.
Can I have a follow-up?
Absolutely.
The question was about recreational legalization, and I want to be very clear that I support the decriminalization of the use of marijuana, and locking people up for that is ridiculous. And but full recreational use, I think there's some things that we need to get sorted out.
Great. And Representative Wilson, on full recreational use, do you support that, or because you kind of touched on decriminalization? What about recreational use?
Well, I think that is answering the question.
Okay.
So if we take marijuana right now and we say that when you have a certain ounceage of it in your possession, you're a felon. That's the exact opposite of the system that we want. So I believe when we decriminalize that and allow for a civil penalty, that's probably the first and best step for Wyoming right now. Great.
Awesome. Question from the audience. Under the current system, for those of you out there, a lot of the budget work is done by the Joint Appropriations Committee that meets in meetings outside the legislative session. And this person would like to know, how can more legislators be involved in that budgetary process? But if you think the system is working well the way it is, please explain why. So I think we're talking to Mr. Taylor now, I believe. Or am I backwards?
I think you're backwards.
Okay, it's your turn.
But I don't want to correct the moderator.
No. That's why I asked. If I didn't want a response, I wouldn't ask.
Not
Go
only
ahead.
are you in control of my time, but you get rebuttals.
You're good.
So the interesting thing is that I think you would find that out of 90 legislators, sadly enough, 90 of them aren't as interested in the budget as you might want them to be, or they lack the expertise to really get deep and involved in it. And so we have an appropriations committee. We have a committee that is supposed to be our expert committee, right? They're supposed to be the ones that are going to vet those issues and look deep into those issues and offer an expertise or an opinion to the entire body of the whole or the committee of the whole to deal with. What I do know is that every time the Joint Appropriations Committee meets, it's open to any legislator to go and attend, just like it is to you and the public. So there is some access, but it is limited. I think improvements that we could make, number one, transparency across the board. So me as a legislator, I can tell you that I don't receive the budget until we're approximately 2 weeks really into the budget session. And that's in part because the committee's working on it. So I don't fault them for that. I mean, they're putting it together and they're making decisions sometimes at the last minute. But me personally, I would like to see the budget sooner. I think that you can rework the budget session in different ways so that you have the budget up front instead of on the back end. That could be, I think, something that would make a lot of Wyomingites more happy, because there's this question about why we deal with issues that aren't budget issues during the session. Most issues really are budget issues if they affect the economy. But ultimately, I think if we took care of the state's budget business first, it would make a lot of Wyomingites more happy.
And Mr. Taylor.
I think that transparency is the biggest issue with this, and we need to make sure that that process is open to everyone. They have their meetings open, and they've started to broadcast them, so that's good. So anybody from anywhere wouldn't have to travel to Cheyenne to actually physically watch the budget process to take place. So there's opportunity to know what's going on, but I think that the budget gets created in the Appropriations Committee. They have special meetings most of the time throughout December, if not throughout the entire year, to create the budget. So there's no reason why the legislators are getting it well into the session. They could have it prepared and ready to go on day one. And I think that the process of amending and working the budget could be a little bit more transparent in the way that those amendments are proposed and vetted through the systems, where every legislator has an opportunity to do that, and that those proposals and amendments are all open for the people to see.
Wait, did you have something to add?
No, I'm just reiterating. I think what's really key is moving that process forward as far as we can. You know, the Joint Appropriations Committee is one of the hardest working committees in the state of Wyoming. It meets for 2 weeks solid in December, and there's no other committee that really does that. And particularly when you have a $1 billion deficit, which is what we faced, a double deficit actually, $800 million in the Education Foundation in 2016. That I know that committee was working up to the last minute, but again, anything we can do to make that system work sooner in the session, I think would create greater transparency.
Okay. Did you have anything to add, Mr. Taylor? Okay, great. So another audience question. The Corporations Committee is currently working on a bill to fix campaign or apply campaign finance reporting laws to independent groups that promote or oppose candidates. Do you support that effort? And I believe it's Mr. Taylor.
Yes, I support that. I think that every piece of literature that comes from a candidate, and that it should be clear who is paid for that, whether it's a third party or the candidate themselves. And so, yeah, I think that it's plain and simple that we need to know where this information is coming from.
Representative Wilson.
I would agree 100%. I watched in 2016 a particular organization in the state of Wyoming produce an ungodly amount of mail throughout Wyoming, and it dropped those in 12 legislative districts. Mine was one of them. It's an organization that dropped 6 different pieces of mail in my district. And to this day, we don't know who donated to that organization. We don't really know who that organization is. We talk about dark money in Wyoming. I think that's the definition of it. And so I thought we would have solutions last year on that. And so I was a little disappointed that we haven't moved the ball forward fast enough. I think that Wyomingites deserve disclosure. They deserve to know whose money's being spent and who it's being spent on. That's part of the fair election process, absolutely.
Great. Okay, and we already kind of touched on budget sessions generally, but during those short budget sessions, there is limited time for lawmakers to consider non-budget bills. But despite those constraints, dozens and even hundreds of bills are filed. Given the limited resources at the Legislative Services Office, I believe it is, LSO, and limited time to consider potential legislation, would you support capping the number of bills that each lawmaker is allowed to sponsor in any given year? And I believe we're starting with Representative Olson.
So really fun question. So I looked something up as I realized you were going to ask that question. So I looked up how many bills we had introduced in the last session. There were 204 House bills and 126 Senate bills. The passage rate is only 42.7. So 42% of all of the bills made it through the budget session. 71 in the House, 70 in the Senate. So ultimately, I think that the system that we have is a very good system in that we wean out the legislation that we don't think is important to have, and we keep the ones that are. And we do that through an introductory vote. You get a 1-minute speech to support in support of the bill that you want, and if it fails to meet the higher majority of votes, then the bill dies. So I think it's a good system. I think that capping legislation, what that does is it disenfranchises individuals. And I want to give you one other statistic. The Senate does that. The House doesn't do that. In the Senate, 72.8% of those bills that passed were committee bills. In the House, you have the exact opposite. And so if you want committees ran by unelected officials sometimes and by special interests, if you want those entities, if you want your bulk, 3/4 of your legislation to come from that area of the law, then you want a cap on the number of bills. If you want individuals like you who can go and approach your legislator like me and I can bring a bill, then you don't want those caps.
Right. Mr. Taylor.
I would say that the introductory vote is a good regulator for the amount of bills that are introduced any given budget session. I don't think that even putting a cap on it would necessarily eliminate how many bills are introduced, because there's, like Jared said earlier, there's legislators that come, they'll introduce 10 bills. There's probably legislators that will come and introduce 0 bills. I've seen legislators not even introduce any legislation. So I think that it would just shift on who is introducing those. The people that typically introduce less bills would probably find bills that they could sponsor and bring. And I don't think that capping the number of those bills would have any impact on the actual number of bills proposed. But I do think that the process of the introductory vote in that is a good process to keep that number down for a budget session where we should be focusing 100% on the budget. And the budget, with all of the amendments and everything, can take a long time to work. So eliminating and reducing the amount of noise in that session is good. And I think that the introductory vote is sufficient.
Great. There's been some recent discussion about non-discrimination laws and whether we need one at a statewide level. It was listed in the governor's endow in part of a study as part of that whole ginormous effort. Where do you stand on non-discrimination laws? Do you think that Wyoming needs to bolster those protections, or do you think that we already have those protections as is? I guess we'll start with Mr. Taylor.
I would support a statewide non-discrimination. I don't think that I've heard from people throughout the campaign that have been affected by this in their housing. I think that we need to make sure that people are able to live in our community, that want to live here, that we're being hospitable to those people, and that we are being good people. And if that's not taking place already, and people are affected and people are losing their housing because of being discriminated against, then there needs to be protections in place and that they need to be put in place. I think that it's not going to be a silver bullet or anything for economic diversification or the end-all be-all, but I do believe that there has been an impact of not having this sort of